Okay, so where do we find sea ice in the climate system? Well, it is predominantly found in the two polar regions, and I shall try and sketch both here. Let's do the Arctic on the left here, and Antarctic on the right. Now, I'm drawing the North Pole in the center, and we have quite a bit of land around here. Let's start with Greenland that we've encountered with regards to land ice. There's Iceland, there's the UK, then we have Scandinavia, Europe, Peninsula, and this all gets kind of distorted since we're looking at the top of the planet. So here then we have Russia, Siberia, there's the Korean Peninsula, and then in the west we have Alaska, the northern Canada, Hudson Bay, North America, and there's the Canadian archipelago, which is a number of small islands in the Arctic Circle. And there's Svalbard, and then the Arctic Ocean is what we typically classify as this region here. And historically, this region, to a large chunk, has been covered by sea ice year-round. But over the last 40 years or so, the sea ice, especially in the summer, has decreased substantially. So in the winter, the sea ice extends to roughly these latitudes. It reaches the Sea of Japan, reaches North Korea. It also extends to the Grand Banks and around east coast of Greenland, and then around Svalbard and to the Russian coasts. So all this region here is covered by sea ice in the winter. Now in the summer, sea ice used to cover most of the central Arctic. And what I'm drawing here is roughly the summer extent of sea ice in 1980. Now this summer sea ice has melted further and further back over the last 40 years. Every decade over the last 40 years, we've been losing about 11% of our sea ice extent. So in 2020, this picture looked roughly as follows. So the trend here, approximately minus 11% per decade from 1980 to 2020. So we've lost about 44% of the summer sea ice that we had just 40 years ago. To provide a couple more facts on sea ice extent in the summer used to be around 8 million square kilometers, which is comparable to the area of the US, and now is more like 4 million square kilometers. And in the winter, each year it grows to be around 15 million square kilometers. And this hasn't changed as much over the last 40 years. So sea ice volume, which is the sea ice extent times its thickness, used to be in the summer around 20,000 cubic kilometers, and that has reduced to less than 5,000 cubic kilometers. In the winter, we had about 35,000 cubic kilometers, and that has reduced to about 17. But the most striking thing here is the estimates of the changes in summer sea ice volume, because that means over the last 40 years, we have lost about 75% of the summer sea ice volume, and in the winter, roughly half. The Antarctic sea ice story is very different. So let's start out with drawing the Antarctic continent approximately with the South Pole. And in Antarctica, the winter sea ice extends over a huge area substantially larger than the sea ice in the Arctic. And that is partially helped because there's no land, there's just the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. So what I've drawn in here is roughly the boundaries of the Antarctic winter sea ice. And very differently to the Arctic, the vast majority of the sea ice completely melts every summer. And you're just left with essentially remnants in the Weddell Sea, a little bit here in the Bellingshausen and Amundsen Sea, sometimes a little in the Ross, and small smatterings around eastern Antarctica. And interestingly, even though the global temperature has been warming and also the Antarctic temperatures have been warming, sea ice in the Antarctic, the winter and summer sea ice covers in the Antarctic, have not seen the same drastic changes that we've seen in the Arctic. So to put some numbers on here for the Antarctic, summer sea ice extent is around 3 million square kilometers, and winter sea ice extent is around 18 million square kilometers. So every year you have this giant seasonal cycle of sea ice melting and freezing. And sea ice volume in the Antarctic is actually quite hard to estimate because we don't know the thickness of this huge seasonal sea ice cover very well.